Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a really wonderful treat to see all of you here. The objective today is to get a glimpse into this book that many of you here have been working on for the past 2 years. It's an almost impossible proposition to ask you to give us a glimpse of your chapters in just 3 minutes. When we did a book workshop here in the same place, just the adjacent room a year ago, it took us 2 days and to get through all the presentations. And so, but the idea here is really our main audience is sitting right next to us here. I just wanted to give, the idea of this event is to give everyone an opportunity to present their chapters and their thoughts about the chapters, what motivated them to write them to Valerie and to bring the book to life, so to speak. Just a logistical announcement, there's one copy of the book, which should be there at the corner. I don't know where it is right now. Which is Valerie's copy. I'd invite anyone who hasn't signed it yet to please sign it, whether you're a contributor or not. That would be wonderful. There are some copies there, and they're not for the contributors because you will all receive a copy from the publisher. There's also some flyers with the barcode where you can purchase the book online. But without further ado, I would love to invite Jonathan to kick us off with short remarks about your contribution.
I'll try to keep the 3 minutes, and therefore I'll talk very fast. I speak on behalf of my co-author, Mark Jewett, a mutual friend, colleague, mentor to both Valerie and me, because Mark and I jointly authored the chapter. And what we tried to do is not only review what would otherwise not be WTO or trade-centric, but rather Valerie-centric, in reviewing her stellar career that predates her presence here in Geneva. But interestingly enough, her ascension parallels the evolution of international economic law becoming ever more central to international law more generally. Of course, we have a century's worth of commercial arbitrations. You'll recall the Goldfields case. You'll recall the importance of expropriation cases in the 50s that we had already at schools and in jurisprudence, the evolution of the law of expropriation, for example. Then came the new international economic order, coincident with the rise of the South and redefining terms of trade, investment, and so on. But through the early 80s with the NIEO, the start of the Uruguay round, the start of the modern era of free trade agreements, beginning with US-Israel, followed immediately by the more important, dare I say, Canada-US FTA in 1986, launched, completed in 1988, followed, of course, by the NAFTA. You had that unfolding alongside the academic community contributing, I think, mightily. I would cite in particular Andy Lowenfeld, may he rest in peace, his tremendous 5-volume work on international economic law, covering sanctions to transnational business law to trade, and of course John Jackson alongside that. Canada, of course, played an absolutely key role in the legalization of the gap into the WTO. Our mutual colleagues Serge Frechette and Deborah Steger were the brain trust that helped develop the dispute settlement system. They weren't given the freedom to do a proper legal scrub, which created more business for Val and others later. And I'll mention a few other Canadians because in the late 70s, Ronald St. James MacDonald, Gerald Norris, and David Johnson published a book called The International Law and Policy of Human Welfare. And what that really did was redefine the paradigm from sovereign rights under international law as being oriented to protection of the integrity of people and territory, to the fact that governments need regulation for international exchange in the name of a people-centric world. So That was well said by another Canadian, Donald MacDonald, in his Hague lectures, who said, you know, sovereignty as integrity has changed to sovereignty as being the right of intercourse between people, businesses, and so on. So in Canada, we trace in our chapter the history of the growth of international economic law as a part of the role of the legal advisor in the Foreign Office and the increased literacy in domestic departments as well. Coming out of the NAFTA and the WTO, we were one of the first to create a dedicated trade law entity, and uniquely we combine the skills of the international lawyers from the legal advisor's office with lawyers from domestic departments, because trade increasingly goes beyond the border to a range of domestic jurisdiction. I was the founding head. I have 2 seconds left. We started with 12 people. Valerie, being an empire builder as she was, turned it into a massive world-class unit of 70 people. I don't know if that was the number when you left, but it was well on route to that. So all of which is to say, her history is in microcosm and in a personified way the history of the evolution of international economic law generally, within which trade law is a subset of that as well. So we're put at the front, I think, for good reason, because it's a look backward at the evolution. We think it contributes to academic as well as practitioner perspective. He or she who doesn't read history is doomed to repeat it. So there are some lessons there as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm going to jump ahead a bit in the table of contents to Kathleen, because she has to leave soon, and I know Jennifer too, so please, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Nicolas, for, first of all, for putting all of this together. I'm honored to be in the room and included among the contributors to the volume. Count myself among those who are in the Valerie fan club, which, just looking around the room, it's quite the club. So as I say, I'm honored to be here. This chapter turns to FTAs, another space where Valerie has, I won't say played a transformational role, but continues to be an important contributor in that space. And particularly it looks at what non-governmental entities are doing in FTA disputes and whether they play an important role, how we should think about them. And so it starts by looking at the CUSMA. I think I have to say CUSMA in this crowd. So it starts by looking at the CUSMA, and it shows a mixed record. First, take stock of the landscape. What is it? Now, of course, we haven't had that many disputes, but even among the ones that we have had, it shows that there have been some non-governmental entities that have tried to intervene in these disputes, almost all on the side of the complaining party. And it wasn't until the corn dispute, more recently, where we started to see other NGEs from both sides, an equal number really contributing. So interesting to see that trend, where we really see the support that others would sort of come to the rescue of the responding party, but the pattern has been with the complaining party, with the exception of corn. Same trend appears outside of CUSMA. If you look at CPTPP, if you look at some of the European disputes, the same sort of thing occurs. There are both commercial and civil society actors contributing to the discussion. But across all of them, it appears that their actual impact on the reasoning of the panel is quite limited. Maybe that's consistent with your expectations, maybe not. But that's what at least we can tell from what the panels have said so far. The exception to all of this are labor and environmental disputes. That's where the exception lies, particularly in CUSMA's rapid response mechanism, where we've now had 2 panels come out with their decisions. And in those instances, I will say surprisingly to me, panels have relied on non-governmental entity submissions for things as important as jurisdiction, to use the NGE submission to find jurisdiction in the one instance in support of one of the side's arguments. So what should we draw from these data so far? Again, first of all, most panels do not rely on NGE submissions in shaping their outcomes, although they may provide some degree of legitimacy beyond the 4 corners of the page that we can tell. Second, one reason for this might be the limited number of NGE participants, might be because the opportunities to participate are very limited. And those of you who work under CUSMA know the challenges of the Secretariat, faced by the Secretariat there. So there's limited uptake among NGEs wishing to participate. Third is, I think, again, that poor advertising. So there's both the opportunities are limited, but also the governments release little information about how to participate. So both sides, the Secretariat and the parties. And lastly, again, even where participation occurs, it's a lot of repeat players we see in some similar actors from dispute to dispute. So what does this mean for the future? To close, I will say, firstly, it seems that NGE participation in FTA disputes is largely performative. And so designers of future agreements looking to the next generation, or those maybe looking at a review upcoming, should think more about ways to incorporate non-governmental voices and to strike the right balance between inclusivity and efficiency. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. We have an interesting cluster of 4 chapters who deal with trade and the environment in different ways. And I wanted to invite those 4 speakers to speak next, starting with Jennifer, and then we go to the other 3. Thank you.
Well, this is a surprise since I was not planning to speak, but I will only say that, first of all, I would second or third or whatever, what an honor it is to be part of the Valerie fan club, and to really look around this room and think about all of the lives that you have touched, all of the people that you have influenced, all of the people that you have inspired. Really, it's remarkable. I had to give a set of commencement remarks a while back, and I used this one line of, if all else fails, find people that challenge and inspire you, and stay with them as much as you can. And I will just tell you, Valerie, you are in that category of someone that challenges and inspires us. And so the opportunity to spend, time reflecting on you and your work is really an honor. My chapter is really focusing on the issue that is partly near and dear to me, which is, how do we use trade tools in the fight against climate change? And I prefaced this chapter by saying, I feel like this is in the spirit of Valerie, because I think of you as let's just get things done, in that sort of very way of just roll up our sleeves and make it happen. So my chapter is really focused on how we can use very specific trade tools, to think about taking on the fight against climate change. Things like, couldn't we, and I would say this now, especially in places like the United States, if we're going to put a 50% tariff on steel, can't we bifurcate that line into 2 or 3 different segments of that tariff line to say, okay, leave the 50% on dirty steel, but how about lower the tariff on green steel down to 0? I mean, if we're going to do this anyway, can't we use differentiating tariff lines, particularly for those developing countries that have water in their tariffs, and therefore have room to differentiate their tariffs? Couldn't we do something like that? Again, and again, a whole other series of sort of thoughts on how we use, specific trade tools, whether it's carbon border adjustment mechanisms to differentiate tariffs, to rethinking, again, one of the other ideas out there is whether we could rethink the approach of ISDS to try to help countries that want to shut down coal-fired power, but are very worried about the potential liabilities under an investor-state dispute settlement case. So they therefore are reluctant to take action against those coal-fired power plants. Could we use more of some of the trade tool mechanisms and some of the other ways of thinking about compensating those companies in exchange for giving up their ISDS rights? So it's a whole list of ideas that I would put into the Valerie practical. What is practical and doable, but that would make a difference in the world. Ideas on linking that. Starting from my basic premise of we're just not going to move far enough and fast enough in the fight against climate change unless we use trade tools. Trade tools to disseminate the green technology, trade tools to push back on the fossil fuel subsidies, etc. So that's kind of the gist of my chapter, is let's roll up our sleeves and, in the spirit of Valerie, get things done.
So next we have Ian, who wrote a chapter about energy disputes, and I think really did a great job of really reconceptualizing what counts as energy disputes, and it links really nicely to Jennifer's.
Thanks, Nicolas. So I normally don't care about what people think, but in this crowd, I really do care about what all of you think, and it is indeed an honour to be asked to contribute to this volume, which I'm really looking forward to reading thoroughly. Because I think there's both insights, but it's actually at a particular level, a particular focus that really make important issues. Really quickly, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that I learned from Valerie, or that Valerie helped me to learn as a mentor and friend over the years, but particularly as my boss at the Appellate Body Secretariat. I'm going to talk a little bit about writing and analysis, and I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics, actually. Things that are reflected in my chapter. I'm not going to talk about the substance, but I'd be delighted if some people here would read it. In terms of writing and analysis, Valerie, I think Jennifer alluded to it. I think Valerie, as a lawyer, has a sensible and kind of no-nonsense approach to legal issues, as she does to issues of management and other things. And so one of the reasons I chose the topic of energy disputes was to sort of reflect a piece of practical scholarship that I think addresses an important issue. So the selection of the topic was an honour of Valerie as much as the exercise of analysis and drafting, where I applied not only the skills that Valerie helped me to learn, but some of the phrases and words. I think I avoided the use of while at the beginning of a sentence and replaced it with although. And I always think of Valerie when I do that. The chapter itself is a reflection of my mantra, which is, what would Valerie Hughes do to encounter tricky questions. I said I'd also talk about ethical issues, simply because I worked with Valerie at a time in my career when I'd already done some things, and so I was starting to encounter perceived and actual conflicts of interest and what to do about it. And Valerie helped me with various disclosures to the director of the division, and I set out a few cases as a result of work that I'd done in the past. The words "out of an abundance of caution" entered my lexicon, and I still use them today. I mention that because I encountered an interesting ethical question as I drafted this chapter. AI burst onto the scene somewhere halfway through, the second draft or something, and I was thinking about how do I use AI tools, generative AI, to improve my scholarship. So I did. I ran my draft through ChatGPT or whatever AI I was using at the time, and sort of asked it for some critical evaluation and things. Later on, as AI has developed, I've encountered more and more questions about who's using AI for what. In dispute resolution, for example, is evidence being generated by AI? Meaning essentially it's made up. Are counsel and arbitrators using AI to draft parts of the report? I think it's undermining trust in the whole system, because dispute resolution is fundamentally a human practice, a human process. And it's important for us to maintain confidence and legitimacy, to be transparent about the use of AI. So in the final draft, in the final iteration, I actually dropped a little disclosure in the footnote, explaining not only the cases I've worked on that I mentioned in the article, in order that people can check my objectivity, but I also put in a point about AI and how I've used it. I'm going to try to keep that up with my academic writing, certainly, and also my counsel writings, in order to be transparent to use of AI, and I hope it catches on. That also is an honour of Valerie, who is not only somebody I a role model in terms of what I choose, but also someone who sort of looms large as I think about ethical questions. So I didn't talk about what was in my chapter. Please read it, but reasons why you see certain features in there.
So much good. Matteo wrote a great review of WTO jurisprudence on trade and the environment, which really boils down to the essentials, and I think it will be incredibly useful for teaching the subject going forward.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nicolas. Well, Nicolas first kindly invited me to join this book project. I didn't have to think of it for 2 seconds. Of course, it's such a privilege and honor to celebrate Valerie's career and to celebrate Valerie the person. So thank you so much for the privilege, Nicolas. I had the fortune of working for Valerie in the very early stages of my career. In fact, Valerie and I started working in the legal affairs division on the very same day. The one teeny tiny difference in job title and responsibilities was the fact that she was the director and I was the most junior intern. Basically, to Valerie, thank you so much for your mentorship, your guidance, your support over the years. It really meant a lot. Now to my contribution. I decided to focus on what I thought was a very hopefully useful and topical point, which is what lessons can be drawn from WTO jurisprudence on trade and environment in this time where governments around the world are adopting more and more novel trade-related environmental measures. And in particular, we all know that WTO members can pursue legitimate policy objectives. But in light of all these novelty of measures, I thought it was useful to focus on two key questions. First, how much policy space does WTO law actually provide members to pursue environmental objectives? And perhaps more importantly, what legal considerations should policymakers keep in mind when designing these kinds of measures going forward? So maybe starting with the first question, and I'll be brief. I think it's clear from the very early days, starting from US gasoline and US shrimp, that WTO adjudicators interpreted key provisions in WTO rules in a way that provides ample policy space to pursue environmental objectives. And we know the cases interpreting exhaustible natural resources under the GATT, Article 20. So there is no time now to dwell too much on that, but turning to the second question, which is focusing on the limits. We do know that that policy space, of course, has many limits. And that's where I also found that over 30 years of jurisprudence, WTO adjudicators have actually developed a number of very important substantive and procedural checks that should guide members in adopting these kinds of measures. And particularly going forward, this can assist policymakers that are developing these measures. And I would like to perhaps just highlight three areas as of now. The first one is that when designing and adopting and implementing trade-related environmental measures, international cooperation matters. And this basically means that these kinds of measures should have, ideally, cooperative mechanisms in place, should be open to considering different situations that may be prevalent in other territories that are affected by these kinds of measures. Number two, due process is critical. It is absolutely essential for trading partners to have the opportunity to be heard and to make their case. And this is very important when it comes to now this new wave of measures where there are many reporting requirements that will affect exporters and producers and traders all over the world. And thirdly, when designing and implementing trade-related environmental measures, these measures should ideally be coherent and even-handed. And this is basically about ensuring that the measures are proportionate to and effective in achieving the legitimate objectives being pursued. So just to wrap up quickly, my main insight from the chapter, which I will read, is that over 30 years of jurisprudence, WTO adjudicators have actually developed a very nuanced legal framework that both supports legitimate environmental action and safeguards the core principles of the multilateral trading system. Hopefully, some of these insights can help guide policymakers moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chair. We do a big round of applause at the end. The fourth chapter in this kind of environmental cluster is by Ron Steinbeck on one of the most exciting developments, I think, in this space recently, which was the fossil fuel subsidy disciplines developed in the Agreement on Climate Change and Sustainability, and more broadly, the discussion in the WTO. Ron, you have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I got my timer. Thank you very much. And similarly, I was very excited to be invited to write a chapter for this book, and especially through this to get to know more about Valerie's stellar career and so forth. But the what I thought was a little bit funny was that my chapter doesn't really have anything to do with dispute settlement, and one good reason for that is that there've been very few disputes related to fossil fuels, and they've really only been tangential to, when I say disputes, I mean requests, including just for consultation and so forth, where the fossil fuels might be part of it because they were underpriced. So just basically in terms of my chapter, I start off talking about the nature of the problem. I assume I don't have to elaborate on the problem of fossil fuel subsidies. They're now in recent years over $1 trillion a year, and they're mostly in the form of underpricing of fossil fuels. It's been a tradition among particularly producing and exporting countries to keep the domestic price low and to export at world market prices, something which in the WTO parlance has been called dual pricing. That not only encourages overconsumption of fossil fuels, but also it then makes it more difficult for alternative forms of energy to compete. So I mentioned dual pricing. That's really what the focus was of in the GATT and in the early years, particularly towards the end of the Tokyo round. The oil price crisis, which affected other energy forms in the 1970s, exposed the fact that you had these big gaps between domestic prices for fuels, which were, of course, affected then the production price for a lot of energy-intensive industries, and then the export price, which the importers had to pay. And despite some tenuous efforts to try to get fossil fuel subsidies into the Uruguay round, it didn't really catch on, and so what we've seen since the beginning of the Doha round, that there have been efforts, particularly led by New Zealand, to try to get the fossil fuels into the WTO discussions, and they more formally did that in the 2017 ministerial conference in Argentina with a group of 12 countries signing on to a declaration. But again, nothing really much happened until the 2022 ministerial, where they finally said, okay, we have now a group of 48 countries who are really calling for to reduce and provide some disciplines, and that led to the formation of this thing called the Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform Group. Okay, so basically the rest of it is describing what their work has been and how the recent agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability, the ACTS, which is only 4 WTO members signed, but could perhaps serve as a model for their work.
Thank you so much. So we've been moving a bit out of the order of the book, but I want to now return to the second part, which is about the history of the Legal Affairs Division. And I'm particularly happy and proud of that we have a few chapters which I think address issues which haven't really been much written about. One is the internship program, and the other one, the digital registry. But unfortunately, I think the internship chapter is now a bit of an obituary. But still, it's wonderful to have your recollections. So I'd love to invite Jenya and Daniel to talk about it.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Nicolas. It's such an honor and a pleasure to contribute to this book. Firstly, to be among these contributors. I've been at the Secretariat for 13 years now, but I still feel like a little kid when I sit around a table like this and see names of practitioners and academics whose work I read and relied on in law school and really continue to rely on. So it's a great thrill and a privilege. And also, it's an enormous privilege to be able to express, in a very, very small way, my gratitude and my admiration for Valerie. Valerie is one of the few people whose impact on my life has been just fundamental. She changed my life. What else can I say? I mean, you hired me as an intern, you supported me, you encouraged me, and I can never express my gratitude for everything that you've done. So this is just a very, very small way of trying to say thank you. In saying that, I think I speak for many people for whom Valerie is fundamental, for whose career Valerie has been really a bedrock. And one way that's happened has been through the internship program. There are so many people, as Jenny will talk about in a moment, in all areas of international trade law and practice who owe their careers really fundamentally to Valerie. I won't say very much. Jenny will talk a little bit more about what's in the paper, but I did just want to pick up on something that Nicolas said, whether or not this is an obituary for the internship program. We certainly hope not, but in the original draft of the paper, in the last section, we had this sentence: despite occasional budget strains, resources continue to remain available to employ interns. When we were doing the final revisions, I sent back a note to Nicolas saying, I think we need to delete that sentence. And he wrote back to me saying, this is the saddest edit that he's had to make in the book. And I think it is terribly sad. At the moment, the fact is, we don't have an internship program, either in the Legal Affairs Division or anywhere else in the Secretariat. The internship program has been suspended indefinitely, as far as we know. And I think that's a real loss. That's a real loss both for the many, many young people who are interested in international trade law all around the world. And it's also an enormous loss for the organization and for the trade law community. I think interns contribute so much to the system, far more than we often give them credit for. And part of the aim of this contribution was to try and shine some light on the really important work that interns actually do. And I'm going to hand it over to Jenya. And by the way, I just want to also thank Jenya and our other co-author, Rod Izania, who is not here. But totally thank Jenya for her extraordinary work in helping to put together this paper. And I'm going to hand it over to her to talk really about precisely the contribution that interns have made, and hopefully end on a celebratory rather than a funerary note.
Yes, we did change the order last minute to go to this, and I also thank you very much. Until 2 days ago, I had not met Valerie, but all the comments that I've heard were extremely heartwarming. So thank you also to you for inviting me to participate in this article. I'll be very quick. So this article has basically two aspects. One is to describe the program, and the other was more of a statistical analysis to see who are the interns who have done internship, what has happened to them, what was the profile of the interns, and how this evolved through time. And we did this statistical analysis, and we came to very interesting conclusions. The main one is that the internship program has been extremely diverse. So we counted 68 members from which interns have come, of which about 50% come from high-income countries, but also about 30% come from lower middle-income countries, and even 20% from lower middle-income countries. So to us, this is already a description of the evolution of who participates in the system. The system has also evolved quite a lot. So now interns come for about 6 months, and we have described how this has evolved through the years, mainly because compared to other systems, at the Legal Affairs Division at least, interns have substantive work. Those who have come as interns have sometimes been thrown deep into a case right at the beginning of their internship, which has its pros and cons, but ultimately is the way the internship works. And we also did some interesting research about what has happened to those people after they left the internship program. Immediately afterwards, so we saw that about 1/3 of those people stayed at the WTO immediately after the internship program, be it at the Legal Affairs Division or elsewhere. In the long term, of course, life changed, and the system has existed for 30 years. We found that about 50%, a little bit less than 50%, now work in the private sector, and about 20 work at the WTO, and 20 work in government and or academia. So we found this very interesting to see how, even if the system now doesn't work, there is also this way in which the Legal Affairs Division of the WTO internship program help people create passion for WTO law, and then they take elsewhere. They take to the private sector, to academia. It was surprising to me to see a lot of names that I had not known that they had done an internship. So it's a very interesting experience, and coming back, it's more of a positive than a negative ending for this.
Thank you so much. Another chapter which I'm really passionate about passionate about all the chapters, but this is like really unique, is the one by Marissa and Lizzie on the creation of the digital registry.
I'll start also just by saying that I am one of those former interns. I worked with Gabrielle when I was an intern, and I left to go back to my government, and then I came back to the WTO. So actually, I think this chapter is important to talk about how dispute settlement is not just the esoteric or academic or theoretical issues of the agreements and the problems, but also how the members interact with us, with the Secretariat, with the system, and how we provide service to the members in actually resolving their disputes. And when Valerie arrived, we had already sort of started the thought process of moving to the digital, to an e-filing system. And I think Valerie was maybe not so eager because, computers and systems weren't exactly her thing. But she also saw, and I think this was really important, that we had to serve the members better, and we had to be more organized, and we had to have a better record, and we had to have access to the documents in a way that was good. And so she helped us get started, and she drove this project through with some reluctant stakeholders, with some stakeholders who wanted to take over the project and do it their way. But I think what happened was we did a tour de top of all the other sort of organizations out there that were doing e-filing, from my former employer, the U.S. Department of Commerce, to the ECJ. She even got some budget for me and Alan Yanovich to go to Luxembourg and visit them. And we did all of those kinds of things, and we worked through, and I think this was really critical, getting the requirements of the members, from the members, consulting them, having working meetings with them, not making them feel like this was something that was being imposed on them, but something that was really being designed to serve them. I remember some reports to the DSB. And then, we were off and running, and Lizzie and I were primarily responsible for dealing with the contractors, dealing with the issues of the design and everything. But I think, as anybody who's done anything project management wise knows, the project sponsor and the project leader is really absolutely critical, and that was Valerie's role. And it was just negotiating several divisions that deal with dispute settlement, our IT colleagues, the members, everything, and that wouldn't have been possible without Valerie's role and Valerie's indomitable will. And we also briefly talked about another innovation that Valerie instituted, which was the hiring of paralegals. So we mentioned that a little bit briefly as part of her overall goal of just making sure that we're servicing the members properly, and that the procedural aspects of things are moving along, not just the interpretive aspects of things. So that was the focus of the chapter. I don't know if Lizzie wants to talk about actually being the registrar and what that all means.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Valerie. Like Daniel, you recruited me, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity you gave me. I had done a similar job at the Chamber of Commerce in Guatemala, but I had been working on other trade issues at the WTO. And coming to work with Marisa on this huge project of indexing and cataloging thousands and thousands of exhibits and submissions and documents and communications was a great challenge. And without your support, this would not have been possible. I think the legacy is indisputable. You were at the forefront of what was the future of dispute settlement. Without an electronic filing system during the pandemic, we would have suspended operations, and we didn't. We continued smoothly, but it required years of work and preparation. In your approach, being the sponsor of this project, I always liked very much how you were inclusive, and this is mentioned in our chapter, not only with members, which obviously were the demanders of this project, and ultimately the users, the main users. And so there was the working group. We began that with the DDSR and then continued with DORA. We regularly inform the DSP about the progress in the project, and also you created the steering committee for this project, where all the legal divisions were involved, from the Appellate Body to the Rules Division, and then I took on the lead of organizing everything that physically needed to be done to have all this information available for everyone around the world. And nowadays, I'm very happy to see it's the digital system, the e-filing system is what's used in all dispute settlement procedures at the WTO. It's a very flexible tool that will allow us even to use it in different proceedings like the arbitrations. You've also used it in the MPIA. And so thank you very much. I think this is a very concrete demonstration of your dedication towards the efficiency of the dispute settlement system.
One final note, and Lily didn't mention, but actually the Central European Free Trade Agreement actually came to us, and we have allowed them to clone DORA so that they will be using it for their dispute settlement systems. So it's going beyond just the WTO. It's moving elsewhere. So.
Thank you so much for listening. Gabrielle, you also had a chapter, said you didn't want to speak, but yeah. So, Gabrielle has a chapter on secretariat support for dispute settlement panels, so I highly recommend that one. And then we have a chapter by James Flett, which is actually proposing a different approach to standard of review. James, can you hear us okay? Do you want to present your proposal for 3 minutes?
Can you hear me?
We don't hear you.
Oh, great. Hello, Valerie. I'm going to speak to you directly, if I may, because otherwise it sounds a bit as though you're dead.
Oh dear.
I may have predeceased you. Although reports of my death may be greatly exaggerated. Having had the privilege of spending many hours under Valerie's steady, inscrutable, sphinx-like gaze, first of all in the appellate body and subsequently, somewhat spookily, at panel level as well, I have found myself wondering, what on earth is going on inside your head? So when asked to contribute, it was an opportunity to put that question on the table. So as Nicolas has said, the paper's about standard of review. It's most definitely not about that question through the lens of interpretation, nor through the lens of what the standard of review of facts and evidence may be, which blurs into questions about the meaning of municipal law. I think both of those debates are quite well documented, a bit stale, maybe. I'm not sure I've seen much progress there for some time. So instead, the paper is looking at the question of what do we think the standard of review is when it comes to applying the law to the facts? And it sort of sets the problem up in conceptual terms, because that's what I'm interested in. Do we take the interpretive rules, take the law, take the facts and evidence, and ask ourselves, what is the answer to the problem that best fits the law, the interpretive rules, the facts and the evidence? And the one that best fits is the right answer, and that's the only right answer. Or do we rather think that there might be more than one outcome, more than one way of writing down the legal analysis, applying the law to the facts, that is consistent with the agreements? But what do we actually think on this point? And it asks that question about panels, but of course it would have a knock-on for the appellate body, because if panels have some leeway, whatever word you want to use to describe the concept, and they stay within it, then it's difficult to see that they've committed any error, let alone a legal error, capable of a successful appeal. So the paper looks at the so-called special standard of review in 1762, not because it's about that at all. It looks at it just to draw inspiration for what the WTO might think the term standard of review means conceptually, so that one can unpack the problem a bit more. because that is the only place in the agreements where the term is used. And it asks a question, does Article 11 of the DSU really contain a standard of review or a complete standard of review when it uses the term objective? I must say I have some doubts about that, because objectivity is an ideal that a good adjudicator might strive towards, but I think a good adjudicator knows may be unattainable ultimately. I think what it means is that we're only supposed to be looking at the law, the interpretive rules, the facts, the evidence, the arguments of the party, and no other exogenous considerations. And we would want our adjudicator to be objective in that sense, irrespective of what we think the standard of review might be. I think that's very clear. And it might seem shocking to say there's no complete standard of review in the DSU, but there's no statement about burden of proof either, and many other things. And these, of course, have been dealt with by looking at general public international law rules, if you like, to fill those gaps, I think, in a completely legitimate way. And the paper also asks, what is the standard of review that best fits the institutional structures of the WTO, which, as we all know, doesn't have an executive? And essentially, the thesis is that the standard of review that best fits, bearing that in mind, is one that does recognize a certain leeway, latitude, whatever word you want to use to describe, but conceptually, that there may be more than one way of looking at a problem and resolving it, and all of these ways are actually consistent with what's in the agreements themselves. And if that's true, and if it's true that maybe, although the dispute settlement system, I think, had functioned brilliantly over 25 years, but maybe the standard of review was a bit tight. Maybe that's contributed to some of the tensions between the so-called judicial branch and the so-called legislative branch. And maybe when we eventually get dispute settlement back in a sensible form, maybe the MPIA is doing that, let's see. Maybe a feature of the resurrected WTO dispute settlement system, which is a necessity, so we'll come back eventually, would be a standard of review that recognizes this. I'll shut up in a second. 1762 is often seen as an attempt to transpose Chevron from a domestic context where you have legislature, judiciary, and executive into the WTO, and it fails because there's no executive in the WTO. So there's nobody to give discretion to. But maybe it's the very absence of the executive, and if one focuses on this question not of interpretation but of the application of the law to the facts, and one arrives at the conclusion that there is some leeway, maybe in fact, as the note, as the document attached to the I'm shutting up. The anti-dumping agreement indicates, maybe the standard of review in 1762 is the general standard of review. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. And we also have a small section in the book about developing countries in WTO dispute settlement, and I'm delighted that Henry and Ventura are here to present their chapter. Or not present, just give us a gist.
Yeah, I'm not going to present the book. Thank you, Nicolas, and thanks Valerie for everything. So I also benefited greatly from Valerie as a former intern. Like 23 years ago, I think, when Ian and Young and Werner and Victoria were also working in the Appellate Body Secretariat. So that is how basically I started my career in WTO law, which, I'm still, researching on 23 years later. So I hope I didn't disappoint you, Valerie. I would, as I mentioned, I would not mention the bulk of the book because the person who's most qualified to speak on this, Wen Hua, who not only research on WTO law, but also actually, I think, played it before Valerie, when he was representing the Chinese government in some of the cases. So I will let him speak on that. I would only like to mention the last part of our paper, which is on, there are two parts to the paper. The first part is on China's experience in building the capacity for dispute settlement. And the second part is on lessons for developing countries. So on lessons for developing countries, our conclusion is that actually China's success model might be unique. I think China, like Jonathan mentioned earlier, also spent a lot of effort in building the capacity. Probably, I think they sent many delegations to Canada, probably even Anne Valerie when she was working for the Canadian government while they are seeking accession. But such capacity building, is resource intensive, right? So not many developed countries would have, the resources. And the other question is, do most developed countries really have the need to build up such a capacity? If you are a typical developed country, maybe you have one case every 10 years, right? So why do you want to build up the capacity to have both in-house counsel like Wenhua, or to have dedicated law firms who work on these issues? It would be much cheaper for you to rely on institutions such as the ACWL, with capable lawyers like Young and Now, right, at much more cost-effective rate. So that is basically the lesson we draw. So I will stop here and pass to Wayne.
Thank you very much, Henry. First of all, I would like to say that it's really a great honor and privilege for me to make this contribution to this book. I'm really jealous of many of you because I didn't have the luxury to work under the mentorship and the leadership of Valerie as an intern or some other role. I only had some limited working contact when I worked many years ago in Chinese mission in the WTO. But I would like to see that I personally and indeed the Chinese government benefit a lot from the system. Dispute settlement system, where we have made a lot of contribution to build. Why? Because so when Henry invited me to write some book, I'm really think it's a great honor. So in the book, I want to delve into the detail. Otherwise, I spent a lot of time last time. So I try to say that in this, I studied Chinese relatively successful experience from four perspectives. First one is the personnel and the institutional China attached importance from the start to the dispute settlement. So nowadays, China in Beijing, we have relatively 10 persons specialized on dispute settlement, including WTO law, and in Chinese mission, we have 3 persons. So we have a big team specialized on dispute settlement and WTO law issues, which I think is always very surprising to many people because they are dedicated to dispute settlement and WTO legal issues. This is one aspect that's showing China really attached a lot of importance to this aspect. The second perspective is the Henry just mentioned Chinese government from the start we engage the outside legal counsels and Sadley and Stephen Johnson, White Case and Gold Brothers, many leading international law firms. But at the same time, China not only rely on foreign legal lawyers, they always engage Chinese lawyers. The reason is that Chinese government would like to cultivate the local personnel, and indeed the foreign lawyers are not only teaching teach the Chinese government officials, and they also teach Chinese local lawyers. But nowadays we have a relatively, I think, a small size of Chinese local lawyers who are able to handle some legal issues, which I think is very cost effective sometimes. This is a very good example and maybe something China created from the beginning. Other factors are Chinese government have a lot of activity with domestic academic institutions and domestic industries. So I won't go to detail, but finally I would say that I didn't write this in my book, because China's relative successful experience of using the WTO legal system, WTO settlement, give us a great example. When we make the recommendation to Chinese government how to handle international relationships and international disputes, we always think of sometimes legal manners would be useful because we have a relatively successful. So this will have a long-lasting effect on China's performance at national level. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much. So so the title of the book is Reckoning and Renewal, and I was very happy that we also have a very strong cluster of contributions on the renewal of the system. And so it's framed as arbitration and dispute settlement reform, and I'm so happy that Niall and Jan and Marco are here to speak briefly about their contributions. I had a request here. I don't know whether that's the copy with the signatures in it or Valerie's copy. Otherwise, if we could pass that copy with the signatures around with the pen next to it, so people could sign it, that would be amazing. Okay, Niall.
Thank you, Nicholas. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to echo all the tributes that have been paid to Valerie over the last few years. There was a few years and days, in particular the last few days, none of which are by any means overstated. And for me, it's been a real pleasure to both work with and to know Valerie. I'd also like to pay tribute to Nicolas for organizing this project, and in particular for not naming and shaming any of the contributors that were very late with their contributions. Finally, I'd also like to pay tribute to all the colleagues that have contributed. I haven't read all of the chapters, but those that I've read have been humblingly good. So it's an honor to be in this company. My chapter is the first in the section on renewal, but it talks about something that happened over 150 years ago. As a sort of amateur historian, I've been interested in the Alabama claims arbitration that took place in Geneva in 1872. And reading about that, and at the time I was writing my chapter, paying a lot of attention to all of Marco's good work on dispute settlement reform, it struck me that a lot of the issues that came up in the Alabama arbitration are still the ones we're talking about now. Sovereignty and the extent to which governments are willing to concede sovereignty to binding arbitration, the scope of the jurisdiction of the arbitrators. The Alabama proceeding was almost derailed by a procedural issue. And Valerie was always very keen on reducing the number of claims, so that's another parallel. The independence of the arbitrators was a big issue, and of course it's still, I think, was one of the most discussed issues, and the quality of the arbitrators, one of the most discussed issues that Marco worked on. And even page limits. It's surprising to read about how lengthy the submissions were, which all had to be handwritten and then set in, actually printed by printers. That did not limit the enthusiasm of the lawyers, even in 1872. So these parallels, I think, all they illustrate the axiom that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And we should. I think it's good as we look towards renewing the system to bear that in mind and to proceed a little bit with. I was at an event last night where a public forum where one of the ambassadors present was asked about her strategy for the ministerial and so on, and what they could expect in terms of reform. And she said her government strategy was strategic patience. An expression I have, maybe that's current, but I hadn't heard it yet. But I think when you look back and see how these issues have recurred over time, I think also for dispute settlement reform, strategic patience is also a good way to go. So thank you again, both to Valerie for all she's done for the system over the years, and also to Nicolas for this excellent project and for including me. Thank you.
I think I should just make it clear that I wasn't in the Alabama. Been around for a long time, but.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that you have this chapter on the first MPIA case.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Nicolas for allowing me to be part of this project and this August group of contributors. And Valerie, thank you to you as well. I'm incredibly grateful for having had the opportunity to work with you on the Appellate Body Secretariat. It was my first proper long-term job. You were my first boss, and while I've had many wonderful bosses over the years, including the one who's sitting right here, but bosses are a bit like first loves. They're very formative, and everything that I have learned from you has been very formative. It's accompanied me throughout my career. So the chapter on NPIA reflects my interest in this topic as a former Appellate Body Secretariat staffer. I also had the privilege to work on the first NPIA with the government of Colombia. Of course, Valerie was part of the first NPIA roster. My article is divided into two parts. One is I sort of describe in a somewhat pedestrian fashion the NPIA setup, functions, the features. Of course, it's largely a copy of the former Appellate Body procedure. I describe how it fits into the DSU. But then I look at some of these changes that the drafters of the NPI have introduced in order to improve upon the procedure. And of course, these improvements reflect the criticism of the Appellate Body. So the 90-day deadline, strengthening of it, streamlining, substantive and procedural streamlining. Article 11 DSU claims this nudging of parties towards smaller, prohibition of unnecessary findings, so prohibition of interdicta or mandatory autonomy. And I try to do two things there. One is that I try to defend a little bit the Appellate Body's record on that. I think the criticism of the Appellate Body has been unduly excessive, and not enough has been said, I find, to defend the Appellate Body. And so I tried to do that. That was really important for me. And then I try to provide a few ruminations on, what these changes, these improvements will bring. And for the details, please read the chapter. I mean, by and large, I think they're wonderful ideas. They're excellent. They're legitimate. And I think the NPIA arbitrators have done a very good job to operationalize them. And of course, many things remain to be seen, how they will emerge over time. But I think it's also important as sort of I sound a word of caution about getting the balance right? I mean, parties should not have the sense that their legitimate litigation strategy choices are being curtailed too much. The due process is respected, things like word limits, etc. And I sort of analyze situations where I feel that maybe sometimes the balance may be a little bit off, or where potential pitfalls lie. So again, I talk about word limits or the mandatory judicial economy, because I think ultimately, despite the changing nature of the legal regime, etc., there's some fundamental truths that remain about dispute settlement, and they're especially true for smaller developing countries that Nal and I work with. Is that there are legitimate political goals of the dispute settlement system, and it's very important that governments get the sense that they have been able to present their arguments, they get their day in the court, they can credibly present to their domestic stakeholders. They were able to make all the arguments that they wanted, that these arguments were addressed. Winners don't care why they win, but losers care a lot why they lost, so they need to be told in a sufficient detail. And so it's important to get the balance right between these efficiency, procedural, effectiveness and efficiency on the one hand, but also what governments need and want. And I think success of these improvements will depend on how governments perceive them. Because ultimately, I believe that what matters the most in improving the system on a long-term basis, including for a hopefully renewed Appellate Body, is upstream, is really inducing changes in how governments, think what cases they put before the Appellate Body or an MPIA panel, and the incentives for self-restraints, rather than policing their actual choices that have been made. And I think those should be respected once they are made. So with that, thank you very much again to Nicolas and to Valerie. Thank you for your contributions to the system, and it's a pleasure to be part of this wonderful group. Thank you.
So it was, of course, very sad, I think, when Marco was no longer able to lead the dispute settlement reform discussions, but there was one person who saw an upside, and that was me, because then I could ask you to contribute to the book. I was incredibly grateful that you were so willing to create, I think, which is this really important historical record of your recollections of leading the discussions. Unfortunately, you don't have time to take us through it, but I'd love for you to just have say a few words about your chapter.
I prepared this because I tend to speak slow and too much. But thank you, Nicolas, for the privilege of contributing to this remarkable book and for gathering such an outstanding collection of authors and papers. I'm truly honored to be here this morning and, of course, to be part of Valerie's fan club. More than 20 years ago, I was a very, very young delegate of Guatemala to the WTO. I am still young. But in a presentation, I listened to Valerie saying, mean what you say what you mean. And you won't believe it, but those words left a deep mark on me. Valerie's clarity and integrity set the standard. I had to try to live up to ever since. So in our world of international negotiations, especially when it comes to dispute settlement, this principle is essential. Precision, clarity, these are, standards that pave the way for genuine solutions. So in my paper, I offer a behind-the-scenes account of the informal WTO reform process from my perspective as its facilitator. The paper explains how it all began, why an informal and interest-based approach was chosen, and how the process actually unfolded step by step. As you will see in the paper, it was not easy to get started. The journey took us from, skepticism through hundreds of meetings and proposals to the drafting and eventual presentation of a consolidated text. The text, it is important to mention, is the result of, collaborative effort from all WTO members. It was not, my text. It's the text of WTO members. But I invite you to read the paper because you will see step by step what we did and how we achieved what we achieved in the consolidated text. It is true, not all issues reach the finish line, namely, the appeal review mechanism. Too bad. But this is what it is, it's the reality, and that gave me the opportunity to write a chapter in this book, which is, something that I truly appreciate. Let me close where I began, with Valerie's words, mean what you say what you mean. I truly believe that if WTO members are to overcome the challenges that we have today, we must embrace clarity, honesty, and the spirit of genuine collaboration. This is something that we are missing right now in the current circumstances, and we need to come back to basics, the basics concepts that led to the creation of the WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another contribution that the book tries to make, and we heard a bit from Kathleen earlier, is to look at FTA dispute settlement and the resurgence of, or really emergence of FTA dispute settlement as a significant part of the dispute settlement landscape. And we have, I think, a wonderful chapter by Tony Pendusa, who's unfortunately not here, and also by Michael Solos on that. We have here Scott Falls, who is one of the students of Valerie from Queens and mine, and whose chapter, or thinking about using WTO Secretariat to support FTA dispute settlement, actually originated as a trade lab project at Queens. And so, Scott.
Well, I'd like to start, of course, by joining the chorus of others and expressing my gratitude for the opportunity to contribute to this amazing publication in Valerie's honor. And I think I have a unique position of being mentored by both Nicolas and Valerie. And so I really owe a huge part of my career to both of you. Nicolas and Valerie were my moot court coaches when I was a Queen's Law student. So I'm realizing as I'm sitting in this format, guys, bringing up a lot of pleasant but also slightly terrifying memories, but pleasant nonetheless. So I'm really grateful to be here. As Nicolas mentioned, my chapter looks into the prospect of using the WTO Secretariat to support FTA disputes, and also, as you mentioned, it sort of originated as a trade lab project that I participated in back when I was a Queen's student. And Our conclusion in 2018, when we finalized this report, was that it was highly unlikely that in the short term, the WTO Secretariat could be used in such a manner. But given sort of the intervening events since 2018, which I'm sure we're all very aware of, I thought it might be appropriate to reevaluate the conclusion and see if anything had sort of changed in the interim. And as I'm sure most, if not everyone in this room really knows, the contributions of unseen actors, or sometimes called, in international dispute settlement is integral to sort of the procedural efficiency and effectiveness of international dispute settlement. However, when you start looking into secretariat support and FTA disputes, it's fairly evident that they're either non-existent in a lot of cases, or they're quite constrained in their mandates and the resources that are allocated to them, which can ultimately impact the effectiveness of the support that they provide. So the consequences of these are not insufficient, right? Or sorry, they're not insignificant. They can actually have practical consequences on ranging from delays to being able to produce a report because you don't receive timely and adequate translation services, issues with payment and remuneration, issues with having the technological infrastructure to be able to have transparent and also just accessible proceedings. So arguably, this all affects the efficiency, cost, transparency, and arguably the quality of the reporting. Yes. So this kind of raises a question, well, is there a possible solution in outsourcing FTA dispute settlement administration to the WTO Secretariat? And in my view, of course, the WTO Secretariat would be incredibly well placed to provide this sort of support, given the expertise and the experience that the Secretariat has. It's just simply unrivaled in international trade disputes when compared to other institutions. But as I get into a little bit in my chapter, I still see that there are a number of legal, practical, political, and financial obstacles that ultimately led me back to the conclusion that I arrived at in 2018, whereas I feel like at this moment in the short term, it's still a bit difficult to envision the WTO Secretariat taking on such a role. But I didn't want to end my chapter in a pessimistic manner, so I started to consider it something that Kathleen has written on before and I have engaged with in the past, and that is the role of possibly other institutions. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration recently administered, it registered its first interstate trade disputes in 2024, and with the PCA's support, the panel managed to turn around a fairly complex 300-page ruling in, I think, a little over 3 months from the date of the establishment of the panel. So, I mean, coming from the commercial and investment arbitration sphere, that is remarkable. I can't imagine an award being turned around in such a short period of time. And of course, while the PCA right now doesn't have the same sort of institutional knowledge of the WTO Secretariat, there are other sorts of innovative prospects that have been developed in other spheres of international dispute settlement. The Swiss Arbitration Association has collaborated on a tribunal secretary platform for commercial and investment arbitrators to essentially gain access to freelance tribunal secretaries. So these are sort of solutions that are being proposed and exist sort of in other spheres of international law. And it's possible that maybe when we look to apply them in the FTA context, it can improve the efficiency of FTA administrators.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Scott. That's wonderful. So we have two final presentations, which are really key to the book. And one is by Royston Tanner and Adi Lopal, who have done amazing work looking at trade concerns. And because I think as dispute settlement and negotiations face their crises, that function of the WTO to serve as an outlet for these concerns has become ever more important. And so I'm so happy that you were able to provide such a substantive contribution. You could also present, I know, for 45 minutes, but you only have 4.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by thanking you again for the invitation to participate in the book. And actually, I have known Valerie in several different capacities. I just want to mention 3 of them. The first one was Valerie being a panelist, in fact, during a dispute during COVID. And I think you don't have a chapter of dispute settlement during COVID, which was extremely, extremely painful. We had a panelist in Sao Paulo, another one in Ottawa, and another one in New Zealand. And then the Secretariat meeting were beginning at 11 p.m. and then going all the way for many, many hours. So that would be another part if you ever have a revision of the book to Then I just wanted to thank Valerie. I don't know if you remember, but at some point, most of you know me, I'm a tariff expert, and I actually came with a proposal to Valerie to actually have a CAT disputes database, which was very strange where it was coming from, but I'm a bit amateur historian myself, so I proposed that, and Valerie, I was surprised she accepted very quickly to develop that project as well. And then inside the Secretariat, we have all sorts of legal needs, and then first thing you do is, let's go legal. So we know Valerie a lot in that respect. So I'm going to be referring to that type of work. And the question we were exploring was relatively simple. There is this kind of like process where in the mind of delegates happens before you have a dispute, which is you talk bilaterally to the member, it doesn't work, you bring it to a committee, it doesn't work, you elevate it to the Council for Trading Goods, where it normally becomes a bit more political, it fails, then you go to a dispute. Normally, these kind of things do not really go to the General Council, no? So the question was very simple. Does this really happen or not? Just perhaps to give you the quick answer is it was not really happening. It is increasingly happening, not in all the areas. So since the appellate body has had its crisis, you have seen a huge increase in the number of trade concerns. Just to give you an idea, we used to have maybe 2-3 being discussed per meeting. Nowadays, we can have 47 easily. Many of these repeating because basically they don't really have the possibility to go to a dispute, so members just keep raising them over and over again over time. About 80% of them have been raised over the last 5 years, so a huge, huge number. And the interesting part is each time you have these new trade concerns being raised in the Council for Trading Goods, about 2-3 of them are going to become disputes. So it's interesting because the number of disputes, of requests for consultations is going down. The number of trade concerns is exploding, but the number of the trade concerns that become disputes is also, let's say the proportion is increasing, right? So what we noticed is that you could see that this elevation type of system was not really working for 25 years, but for the last 5 years, it is something that is, you can see more clearly. However, it is quite uneven in terms of the areas where this happens. When it comes to rules, it just doesn't happen. But when it comes to many of the other areas, like issues relating to the GATT, issues relating to SPS, TBT, agriculture, etc., you do see that more clearly happening. So I'm not going to bore you with all the technical details. There's a lot of charts. I think we were competing with Jenny and Daniel too, who had many charts on this. I know for lawyers it's often very painful to see numbers and charts, and we went a bit far in terms of the ones we were including here. But I just wanted to finish with a very interesting aspect. Is the system working, right? Because this is something that I think Jorge was mentioning when we had the reception. For trade concerns, we didn't really have an answer. But about 2 months ago, the CTG took a decision where now we're going to have a record as to how many of them have actually been resolved. So we're in the process of contacting members. And then by November, we're going to be able to tell you if this kind of system of having trade concerns is actually giving members solutions to some of those trade tensions or not. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Finally, of course, one of Valerie's big passions after leaving, especially after leaving, but also why you were still at the rapporteur was trade and gender. And one of the biggest surprises for me in editing the book was to see Penelope writings really doing incredible work, like compiling statistics on WTO dispute settlement, women in WTO dispute settlement, which she updated throughout the process. And so I think this is probably the most complete record that we have on the role of women in WTO dispute settlement. And I was also incredibly happy that Margaret Kim, who worked with Valerie and back in Canada, decided to write a companion chapter on gender in WTO trade agreements. And so we have this wonderful package of the chapter on women in W2 dispute settlement and gender trade agreements. And I'm so happy that Margaret was able to come all the way from Canada to present her chapter today.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Good morning, everyone. And so I was a beneficiary of Valerie's mentorship once she returned from Geneva back to Canada. And so we were at the same law firm. And one of the best treats as a junior trade associate was the WTO Lunch and Learn with Valerie Hughes. It was like getting private tutoring with the queen of the WTO, as we often refer to Valerie. And Valerie, your mentorship and your teaching really to all of us has been incredibly valuable. So thank you so much for all that you did. And also to Nicholas for including me in this very meaningful project. And it's just such a treat to be hearing everyone's presentations, and I look forward to reading the rest of the chapters. So my contribution is towards the end of the book in the renewal section, and I've titled it #Trade for Women, a quest for mainstreaming gender considerations in WTO agreements. So I will share one interesting fact I've come to gather as I was doing some primary research. In the past 3 years alone, at least 15 new regional trade agreements have entered into force with explicit gender provisions, and another 9 have been signed but are not yet in effect. And this chapter really builds on the thought leadership piece that Valerie had authored with CE a number of years ago when they were first standalone gender chapters that started that started emerging in the various free trade agreements. So this finding signals something that's very important in my view, which is that gender mainstreaming in trade agreements is no longer experimental. It's becoming the norm. And the question of the hour is whether the WTO should and will keep pace. So my chapter addresses the question by examining how WTO agreements might evolve to better support women's economic empowerment and gender-responsive trade rules consistent with the WTO's founding objective of making global trade both sustainable and inclusive. The chapter is largely structured into 3 different parts. First, I set the stage by highlighting the barriers that women face in participating in trade. So they include not only the obstacles to the movement of goods and services, but also the sort of beyond the border constraints, including the legal barriers that impede women's meaningful participation in trade, ranging from limitations on women's ownership and property rights to restrictions on signing export contracts or registering a business. And second, I turned to examining regional and bilateral agreements. As I mentioned, there are some very interesting new developments. And as many of us know, FTAs and these agreements are often called the laboratories of trade rulemaking. And we see a lot of innovation in this space. Not only are there more standalone gender chapters, cooperation mechanisms, and targeted provisions in areas such as SMEs, public procurement, and digital and e-commerce. But this section also looks at some of the bilateral initiatives such as the Global Trade and Gender Arrangement and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And they illustrate how cooperation-based provisions can advance women's participation in trade. A little bit of a spoiler, but what is particularly noteworthy is that many of these agreements explicitly refer to the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, which was a very watershed moment for the WTO in this space. And although this is a soft law instrument, its growing citation in these agreements show that the WTO remains the recognized forum to handle and address the issues related to women and trade. And finally, I bring the question back in the context of the WTO agreements. How and why has the WTO integrated gender perspectives in some areas, but not others? And in this regard, I highlight one case of success, which is the Joint Initiative on Services Domestic Regulation, which, although modest, it did include a gender-specific element. I point also to one missed opportunity, which is the JSI on e-commerce, where explicit gender considerations were ultimately not adopted, although there were efforts to include them, by Government of Canada, among others. And I identified two areas of future promise, namely the trade facilitation agreement and the government procurement agreement, both of which could be leveraged in advancing women's participation in trade in the future. Of course, these considerations must be tempered by institutional realities. As many of us in this room know, the WTO's consensus model makes innovation somewhat challenging, and the future progress of gender mainstreaming will likely depend on more bilateral approaches and coalitions of the willing. But the lessons from the regional and non-WTO bilateral agreements is clear, which is that explicit provisions on women's empowerment are here to stay. So I hope my research and some of the analysis looking at the missed opportunity success case and what's to be implemented in the future will contribute to this very important dialogue on gender and equality in the WTO agreement. Thanks very much.
Now it's time for a round of applause for our contributors. Yes.
Can I say 20 seconds? Something that was not written about, but we should all, I believe we all know, but we should all recognize outstanding input of Valerie is in her early and continuous support of the ELSA moot process that started as a little, as you know, European thing and now is all over 5 or 6 continents. But when this started, Valerie was the head of the Appellate Body Secretariat. And her support and push made this possible. I mean, integrating the ELSA process into the WTO technical assistance mechanism. Many people work, but having, and this was at the time of the top of the Appellate Body, having the head of the Appellate Body Secretariat asking her staff, Victoria worked like mad on ELSA at the time, doing that on regular work, I think is what made it possible to become what it is now. And it is an investment in the future. And I deeply, deeply care, and I'm sure you all do. And it's, thank you to you.
This went live on the website yesterday. You can all register, you can coach, you can judge.
I don't want to take up a lot of time because we're long overdue, but I did want to thank you all once again for the tremendous effort you made at contributing to this and what all of you have done for my career. I mean, it's, you talk about what I've done with you all, but you've all contributed so much to me, what I've learned, what I've been able to do. So thank you all for all of that and for being here and for contributing to the book. And I really, would you stand up with me and applaud?
Yes. Thank you so much for coming. I have one final request to get the word out. This book will become available open access online. And so when it's not yet on the website, but when it is up, I will send everybody who registered an email. And I would love for you to spread the word.
Thank you.